Hello, everyone. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about the work we've done in collaboration with the Council of State Bioscience Associations, Biocom California, and CLSA around H.R.3, which is the legislative package around international reference pricing. So what does H.R.3 do? Well, essentially what it does is it takes up to 250 single source drugs. So these are non-generic drugs, and that's 125 drugs from Part D and 125 other drugs that can be from Part D, Part B. It doesn't even really matter where specifically. It can be from anything. It doesn't actually qualify under Medicare necessarily. It can be any drugs. And what they do then is they average the price of those drugs against a basket of drugs internationally: Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom, for their pricing. So the US will no longer be a market-based economy where drug pricing is based on essentially what is presented to Medicare and to the pharmaceutical benefit managers. It'll be based on an average of international countries and prices paid internationally plus 20%. And this becomes what is known as the AIM price. The alternative price is the AIM price, or the target price. And what's interesting about this is it's not just restricted to Medicare, it's the entire commercial market. And then drug price inflation will be held to the rate of inflation, so the prices will be sticky and basically stick to whatever inflation rate is held in the United States. And there's a minimal implementation of 25 drugs in 2023 and 50 drugs in 2024. This has been updated recently to 2024 and 2025 on the markup that was released about a month ago. So again, this is what HR3 will do. And what we have done is we've looked at the impact of this under several scenarios. So we look at the minimal implementation of 25 drugs in year 1 and 50 drugs in year 2. There's also a carve out for insulin, and we assume insulin will be held under that same negotiation process of HR3. So we pull out insulin and then run it through the same methodology. And then we look at a full implementation. We don't do the full 250 because we found once you get over 150 drugs, 125 plus insulin, essentially you're pretty much there. You don't have much more to cut. The incremental net impact of each additional drug that gets put in is rather, it's not really germane. I mean, you basically captured everything at a certain point when you've rolled out 150 drugs. So then we model those impacts for the commercial market, not just for Medicare in the US, but also globally. And then we look at HR3 on the ecosystem. So I'm going to walk you through a bit of that now. So what are the results? Well, essentially, this would reduce the amount of revenue for the industry, and this is gross revenue for the companies that are included under the minimal implementation, to $102 billion. So basically $102 billion is wiped out of the revenue of the companies, even under the minimal implementation of 50 drugs in year 2. Now, for a little context, the net revenue of the sector, the earnings before income, the bottom line, as it were, last year was about 171 billion. So we're talking, a 60% reduction on revenue compared to earnings. So it's a pretty significant cut. What we find is that companies that have more drugs or are more innovative, those companies themselves are more impacted. There's no indication for cost effectiveness in this bill. It essentially just goes after the number of drugs that are in the pipeline. So the more drugs you have, the more the impact is. And essentially the drugs that are there are the ones that are the most innovative and command the highest price. So essentially, we're penalizing the companies that may have an entire portfolio of high-quality injectable oncology or high-quality drugs for anti-infectives. Again, it's really it's an approach to drug pricing that penalizes the most innovative companies and actually the areas where we have the highest demand and the highest unmet medical need, which is pretty odd. A third of all the companies impacted lose 95% of their earnings, and that's in all scenarios. Roughly a third of the companies, no matter how many drugs we incorporate, about a third lose 95% or more of their net earnings. So we're really wiping out a substantial part of the sector. As well, we find that companies will probably have serious reactions to this and would try to avoid it. And what would likely happen is you would probably see a lot of European countries no longer getting serviced with drugs. So ultimately, the end result of this under current scenarios is that we're just going to stop treating a lot of people in Europe, which is really the worst case frankly. It's not particularly productive. In practice, what do we see? If we look at this, this is what's called a price ceiling. And price ceilings essentially restrict supply. So if you put a price ceiling below market demand, which is what this would do, you would artificially put a price ceiling below market demand. Essentially what would happen is you'd no longer be able to meet demand, so you'd restrict supply. And we have numerous examples of this. Venezuela and the Soviet Union, where they had food shortages because they were restricting costs. The 70s, the gas shortages, the gas lines for Nixon administration put a price on gasoline of oil, a price of a barrel of oil and gasoline. That actually restricted access to gasoline. What's intriguing is the Europeans have a similar problem right now with their vaccine acquisition strategy for COVID-19. If we look at what's happened with COVID-19, the Europeans have basically gone for a very low floor ceiling price. They basically restricted the price and didn't really care about demand. And what's happened is they've really lost out on having access to vaccines. They've had to really slow down, and they don't have a lot of vaccines. In fact, if you look at the rates as of March 1st, Israel was vaccinating about 1% of the population per day. The United States and the United Kingdom was vaccinating about 0.5% of the population per day. You know, Belgium is at 0.1% of the population per day. It's going to take 800 days at current rates to vaccinate the entire population. We're just at barely cracking 20% vaccinated now in Belgium as of today, after 6 months. That gives you an idea of how this is working out. So it's a problem. It's a real problem. So price controls are difficult, and they don't necessarily work. If we look at this from the standpoint of cost per asset, you can see the 25 drug implementation and the 50 drug implementation. You have 10 oncology drugs, neurology, immunology, rheumatology. These areas get really hit. So the impacts are really structured around the areas where we have the most innovative therapies. If you look at this, this is where we get the $102 billion impact, including insulin in year 2. This is where the numbers come from. You can see how this adds up. So again, it's a really large impact. And the big problem here is that the more drugs you have that are assessed, the greater the impact. So you can see here, companies with more than 4 drugs are impacted by close to $10 billion, whereas 2 drugs are only $2 billion. So it really is additive in that the more innovative products you have, the more you're impacted. You can see here that the top quartile of companies are really overwhelmingly the ones who are hit with this on a revenue standpoint and an earnings standpoint. You can see here that the top quartile of companies lose 121% of their net earnings before interest and tax. This is what's the bottom line. This is what shareholders look for when they invest. So this is really devastating. And then again, you can see here that the impacts are even more magnified when we get to 125 drugs, although I'd like to point out 50 drugs is 102 billion. This is 125 billion. So you can see, even though we've added, 75 drugs, we've only increased the impact by 25 billion, but still quite large. And you can see here the impacts are even greater when you get to 8 drugs. And you can see here that's 12 billion. So again, the more drugs you have that are impacted, the greater the impact. And it doesn't look at quality, it doesn't look at effectiveness, doesn't look at savings that happen to the system. It really is just on cost. So it's really a devastating approach to the sector. And again, you see here, if we look at this from earnings, the top 50% this time lose about 70%. As I mentioned earlier, 1/3 of all companies lose more than 95% of their earnings. So again, very devastating drugs. Now, if we look at this from the standpoint of how the companies invest, you can see the ecosystem impacts here are really challenging in that the US has really dominated in investments into small and emerging biotech by these companies, these large companies that are going to be impacted by H.R.3. The US is dominating this sector. And in fact, we can look at the effects of this from the investment standpoint. These are all the companies that have been invested in. What we see is these ecosystem impacts of how the companies will be impacted. If we look at this statistically with a statistical model, which we built that predicts market entry, these are the drugs that didn't come to market. You can see that these have less investment. The drugs that did come to market have more investment here, 18 billion, 12 billion. And this is a statistically significant model, a p-value 0.1. We can see what happens if we then reduce the revenues based on H.R.3. You can see you go from a 73% probability under the current model to a 49% probability. So you lose many drugs that would normally come to market. You go from 68 to 7. So you can actually see, and this is the minimal implementation, it's even worse. With the big implementation, you go from 68 to 2. So really, the bottom line here is if you look at this from the standpoint of the industry as a whole, this is really going to have an impact on the ecosystem. California alone has 25% of the drugs. They put 17 drugs, they go to 1 drug. And where we're really going to see loss of drugs are hypertension, breast cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, bleeding, lymphoma, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, orphan drugs. This is really going to devastate the ecosystem impacts of investment and how the US has dominated biotech innovation. This will absolutely destroy the sector, will have enormous negative impacts, and be very devastating. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I yield the floor.